So I'm going to be talking about my experiences in terms of what evidence is. This talk is a result of some of my pet peeves in terms of working with regulated spaces and also working with some other teams. So I need to give a little bit of background. So I do consulting. I've worked 25 years now in doing software testing, both in regulated spaces and non-regulated. I specialize particularly around Agile, doing testing, Agile transformation of organizations, and I also I was Director of Quality and Regulatory Compliance for a clinical research organization in healthcare. So in that particular role, I was responsible for presenting our results to external auditors and also auditing my internal organization and auditing my particular suppliers. So this talk is going to be based primarily around my experience in the regulated spaces, but also applied into non-regulated spaces. So what I'm interested at this point in time is understanding the audience a little bit better. So if you're in a regulated space like insurance or financial or flight control or gaming or healthcare, can you raise your hand? Cool. A couple of people. So when I talk about this particular space, my experiences, you're going to have to add some windage in terms of attempting to figure out how it applies into your organization. But that's pretty good. Also, I'm going to have a couple of terms on here which I expect to see red cards. So can people hold up their cards again? Thank you. So I'm expecting to see some red cards. So the facilitator is going to actually have to pay attention during the talk on the audience, please. So this talk is about different types of evidence, the qualities of what that particular evidence is, and then the particular traps that I see that the organizations have around their particular problems with evidence and the anti-patterns that I see. So caringness. So why do I care about this? Like I said, I work in a regulated field. Everything that I generate is potentially going to be in front of a court of law. If that ends up happening, it's because probably people have died. I just worked a year on a large project for a Class 3 medical device where if we made mistakes, it's very possible that we could probably kill 10,000 people across the world before we even knew what happened. So it's very important to have appropriate evidence showing what we actually did and had due diligence in those particular situations to prove that we actually did it, as opposed to just having an opinion that we actually did it. So one of the issues is the difference between the civil and criminal courts. So I live in a world where I can be sued personally by the agency, by the federal government. I can be barred from working in my particular industry if I'm do particularly bad things. So that's a stress in that environment. So having appropriate evidence and supporting that you're being professional is important. It's also important even if you're not in a regulated space, because the type of evidence you have and the strength of that particular evidence is important because it supports the particular story that you're presenting to your business and to yourself and your peers. So strong, credible evidence increases the strength of your particular story that you're trying to tell about testing. So my sources for what is evidence is based off FDA's 21 CFR Part 11, electronic records. And I'm sure all of you understand exactly what I just said, right? Oh, very cool. So I see some red cards. So the federal government has a set of rulemaking, and they put this into gigantic volumes. And if you search on that particular piece, you'll see this is the rule that the agency, FDA, has used to define what a electronic record is. So this is sort of the Bible. No, it isn't sort of. It is the Bible. It's the guidance for the organization or for the industry in terms of what is an official electronic record. They also have some additional rules around good manufacturing practices that also apply to how do you keep records. And so I'm going to talk from that context. My intention is that you should hear what I say, but figure out how it applies into your particular context, whether it's regulated or unregulated. And one of the main keys in making that transition is talking about the difference between what records are and testimony. So records are all about when they're entered into court, the record speaks for itself. So when you see a record entered, you don't cross-examine records. Records with all the verbiage in them are intended to present the entire picture of what was happening at that time. So when you see, this is why when people use non-safety language in particular records saying all or all of the time, or this is a huge problem and we shouldn't ship, and that gets documented in an official record, that can cause a problem further on, because when it's entered into court, it speaks for itself and there's no one to interpret, well, I really meant something else. The other type of evidence is testimony. And testimony is individual people, and you can cross-examine testimony. And when I first started in this particular industry, my assumption was, well, I can be loose on records because I could always testify and explain what they are. But in reality, it doesn't work that way, because the problem is that often you don't have the opportunity to actually be able to explain what your records actually mean. There's a limited amount of time, and by putting you up into a situation where you have to explain your records, you open yourself up to having to explain other things that you don't want to have to be able to, you don't want to have to sit in front of the court and explain other things. So it's important to try to make your documented records and your documented records as strong as possible and as accurate as possible. So what are the different types of qualities of the records that we're looking for? So one of the issues is, primary one is clearness. But this is really cool because the question is, clear to whom? So the issue is, I can write records that are clear to me, but you won't understand them. I can write them for my peer group, and we can understand them, but no one else does. So figuring out where to draw that line is an interesting problem. I struggle with this with different organizations all the time in terms of figuring out how scripted a particular procedure needs to be, or how open it can be in terms of like a session-based charter to describe what the intention of a test session is, and then collecting notes along the way describing what you actually did. So the point is that there's not a specific answer that's correct all the time. You have to use judgment, and it's probably appropriate to be thoughtful and intentional about how at what level you describe your documentation and who your intended audience of that particular document is. So be intentional about who you're writing to. The next one is about being objective. So evidence that doesn't contain who or things that describes well what you did or what you saw is a problem. If it's full of interpretation, that becomes difficult for a third party to actually, it's not evidence, it's opinion. So what you need to do is determine where is that line, and often in regulated spaces, the tools, for example, have to be validated. And we end up validating things like Microsoft Word to confirm that it's actually appropriate to that particular usage. So the question then is, well, at what place do you draw this particular boundary? In the regulated space, we end up validating all our tools. We try to write our particular documentation to the point that we could hand it off and have a reasonable expectation that a reasonable, well-informed third party could actually interpret that documentation and come to the same conclusions. So the intention here is to be very clear about who are you writing it to, and also to what degree are you writing. So the next qualities are being authentic. So one of the issues is there's an intention to detect and resist falsification. There's also the intention to be very clear about whether you're using original documentation or whether or not it's copies. This is quality that they're looking for. So this is why you have stamps saying copy, and people are stamping them in my particular industry. They're always the chain of custody needs to be established in terms of what is the degree of authenticity of a particular piece of evidence. Another one is integrity. So both virtually in terms of its integrity of whether or not I can repudiate it, but also just physical. So physical integrity is kind of interesting. I worked on a medical device when I first started out back in, 1990. And that device was being sold right up until about the year 2000. And in my particular industry, all those records that I generated back then are stored in a warehouse and can be retrieved for 17 years after they stop selling the product. So my records from 20 plus years ago are sitting somewhere ready to be retrieved in case somebody has any questions about what I did at that time. So once upon a time, I had to audit the particular place where we kept those records. And it's like going into, where they stored the Ark of the Covenant at the end of Indiana Jones? Yeah. It's just like that, except dirtier and darker. And not as, and the people were not as well paid. And so you go in there and there's boxes of everything, paper boxes, and you're looking for, some records get chewed by mice. So it's a real interesting experience knowing that all of your documentation is being protected in that particular way. So the ability to protect the physical integrity of your documentation is important. We had a procedure when I worked over at my startup where we had to, every 10 years, go into our vault, pull out all the old CDs that had hit their end of life or were about to hit end of life, and copy them off the CDs because the manufacturers would only warrant them for 10 years. So if you're protecting documentation, like if you're in an insurance company, for hundreds of, or for decades, protecting the integrity of your documentation is an issue. I worked early in my career actually making an imaging system where we microfilmed and digitized insurance company forms. And the intention there was that they were supposed to be able to retrieve this information 40, 50 years later. And the classic story in that environment was the insurance company that didn't do it well, had a fire, had all the records destroyed, and then they were out of business because they didn't know who to pay. They lost all their particular records. So integrity is really important. Let's see. Good for time. Other qualities. So readability. So whether or not a human can read it or a particular machine. So certain records need to have the capability of being read by equipment. Human readability is usually straightforward, but machine is interesting in terms of file formats change over time. In my environment, we will, at the end of the project, if there's specialized equipment that's reading particular file formats or programs or even hardware, it goes in the vault with all the other project documentation. So it's an interesting environment in that way. The other quality is changes. So how are you actually tracking changes? The idea in our environment is that if you make changes to anything, you need to be able to not obscure the information. So it's single line strikeout. You initialize it, you date it, so we know who you were. And then you're supposed to attach a reason for why are you making that change. And this is an interesting one actually. So making simple changes is, in terms of how you strike documentation, is something that I tend to take over into my non-regulated spaces also. I don't like not being able to see what the previous information was before it was struck out. So many of these, that particular one is one that I tend to take over into when I work in digital cameras, for example. Other qualities, attributable. So we want to know, in terms of this particular piece of evidence, who actually did any particular action. So this is a classic one when I audit vendors of mine. I ask, do you have generic logins? I see hands. Do you have like hands from the audience? So who has in their test lab like a generic testing login ID? Yeah, so that would be a finding if I was using your product in my particular environment. The reason being that when I come and audit you and I want to see who did what, when, where, and why, I don't know who that particular person was. From a testing verification point of view, that's one aspect, but it's also a security issue when I come in and audit, because I don't know who was the particular person with that degree of authorization that took particular actions. Let's see. Contemporary. This is another classic one that I struggle with both when I talk to regulated people and non-regulated people. So I'm looking for documentation, evidence of what actually happened. People tend to want to either go really heavy and describe all the different big upfront design aspects in terms of what are we going to do. So the scripted people go there and are very particular and specific in terms of what is the document, what are we intending to do. So if we were doing a trip to, let's say, San Francisco, they would get the trip tick out and they would describe every mile marker along the particular way. But as they actually executed, they wouldn't actually do that. So there's a mismatch between what their intentions were versus what they actually did. The other extreme are the people, and I find this with my session-based people and charters, where they describe, sometimes they describe what they're going to do in a charter, they execute it, and then they didn't capture evidence, so that they run again, but they do like a summary of what they did. So a summary of what you did is not actually what you did when you were testing. So there's that issue of your recollection or your attempt to summarize what you did is not actually doing. I'm questioning whether I should share a particular story. So there's a group that they have a conflict. And the conflict primarily is that they want to show perfect results of their testing. And at the same time, they want to, and that rule is essentially overriding the quality of their session results. So what's happening is they do really great charter explorations of the software. They find all kinds of interesting problems. They get good information about what the product is doing or not doing. And they document all that and they send it off into the system. But they then create the official record of what they did in a summary form. So they go and take their notes and they try to quickly go through and just very cleanly explain what they did. And they assert that that's evidence. So my issue with that is it's not what they actually did. It didn't generate the bug reports. It's just a summary of what they did. There's a reason why they put black boxes on airplanes. And looking into it, once upon a time, there was the flight engineer would actually write down on an airplane what was going on, what the pilots were doing, and that was the document of what happened during the flight. Obviously, after the plane crashed, that particular record wasn't actually very helpful to the accident investigation people. That's why they wanted to go and start to actually automatically collect that information of what actually happened during the flight. So it's very similar to that in terms of my intentions when I do testing. When I do testing, I like to video record everything. So I mic up my testers. Usually we're doing session-based testing with charters. They talk through what they're doing. They describe what the charter is. They describe what they're doing and why they're doing it. And so what happens is I'm capturing that information real time and creating evidence of what actually happened, as opposed to not miking them up and having them sort of write a paragraph out at the end of the process describing what they did. So, yep, right card?
Do you mic them up because you're in a regulated environment, or just because you like to keep the evidence?
I like to keep the evidence. I find it incredibly devastating evidence with external people in terms of being able to say, this is exactly what they did. It also simplifies the taking of notes. So I still take, they still take notes as they go along, but that video and audio evidence of what they actually did is incredibly powerful. So I'll give an example here. So we're doing a particular test where for a product, I mic up all my people. I'll even video and mic up people during design reviews. So I'll go there. But we collect all that evidence, and then I get audited by an authoritative person, so like a client, and they want to say, show me the evidence of what you actually did on this project in terms of how to verify and validate. And I'll hand them the DVD or DVDs saying, here it is, here's the table of contents. You can pick any one of these particular videos. The person will describe, here I am on this day, on this machine. My charter is this. I'm trying to do this particular activity, verify these particular requirements, and do some exploratory testing around that. They go through that particular process, explaining what they're doing and why. They are recorded the entire time, so they say, I'm trying to do this, I'm about to do this, I'm going to set this up, I'm taking these actions. Look, as I hit this, you'll see this. So they do that. You see it. You see the bugs as they appear also. They say, look, this wasn't right. I'm going to make a bug report for that. You then hear them scratching on a piece of paper or typing that they're doing it, which then connects to that physical piece of paper or that output, that text file that got printed. And when I show that particular information to external people, showing that whole chain and how we came to a conclusion, it's really powerful in the sense that it's like they went back in time and actually sat and observed what that process was. And in terms of their comfort, in understanding, are we under control? Do we know what we're doing? Is there sufficient evidence to confirm that we're making appropriate choices and decisions and having appropriate depth? It's incredibly powerful. So.
I just have to jump in here.
Sure.
We are running a facilitated session of open season after the main talk. So that was an excellent example of a question for open season because it required a very long answer. So to be restricted, Griffin will hold on to those questions for open season. However, if you have a burning issue and it requires a red card, please go with that.
True. I tend to run it a little loose. So you and I might end up wrestling at some point. I'm okay with that. So this talk is structured in such a way that I don't want to necessarily delay those. So I'm paying attention to time, but you can always get the hook if I'm taking too long.
Okay, so to revise the rules, so you have to have an emotive response that requires an immediate answer. It has to be an angry question, a statement.
That would be very cool. So that's good.
To the energy in the room.
Yeah.
If not, wait till open season.
Excellent. That's good. Or a caveat. If I'm saying something, you say, that's interesting, but I have no freaking idea how that would apply to my situation. Consider the red card, but it would be a fantastic green card. I assume all of you are writing down questions that you might want to ask during open season. So.
And please wait for the mic to come to you.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So the other thing is, so in my environment, I want to have an audit trail. There needs to be a chain of custody that's very clear in terms of who did what, when, and where with this thing, and some type of revision history that's associated with that. In my environment, you can see from when it was a greenfield initialized product and all the different deliverables that are important to be tracked. You can see that history of them going through the particular process. Another thing is retrievable. So I work in an FDA area. They tend to, the agency in particular when they come, our clients quite frankly are fairly demanding in terms of when they expect that you have this type of information accessible and can provide it to them fairly quickly. So you need to have it physically or electronically available. So telling them that, well, it's stored in Iron Mountain and it'll take 4 weeks to retrieve it is not an acceptable answer in those environments. Typically, you need to be able to say, I have it, I know where it is, this is the method to retrieve it, and it'll take 2 days, 3 days to get the information to you. So knowing where you store things, being organized is important. So another one is qualities, so third-party review and reconstruction. So this is sort of wraps up a lot of these. I need to be able to give to a third party the ability, the evidence sufficient that they can actually start from the process, start from the beginning of the process, walk through that particular evidence and recreate what actually happened during that particular process, and be able to reach the same conclusions and results. So if your documentation supports that, it makes it really easy to assert that your evidence is sufficient and reviewable at that time. So let's talk about traps. I love these. This is the primary motivation for this talk. So what I see is a lot of organizations that I've interacted with usually are pretty good on most of these, but then they tend to be very deficient on one or two of these particular pieces. And so when you go through those particular qualities, and there's weaknesses, it really lessens the impact of your particular message. So if I'm doing software testing, and even if it's not regulated, but I don't know who did it, and I can't find the documents, and I don't know the chain of custody of when it changed, it really weakens the power of that particular piece of evidence to support the assertion of the story, the software testing story that I'm trying to tell, which if you look at James and John's rapid software testing reporting, there's the 3 levels of questions that you're trying to ask. For me, the 3rd level is all about credibility. If you have damaged evidence, it really damages your particular credibility of the story that you're telling. So I like to have strong evidence because I want to have credibility so that when it's a close call at first base, the umpire calls me safe and not out, because the preponderance of all the evidence before suggests that I'm working in a controlled manner. And while I make mistakes, they're willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. So feebleness is the thing that you want to avoid because, like I said, it's unpersuasive. And when I do audits of external people, if I see a whole series of these type of problems with evidence, it really makes me start to wonder about the organization itself and whether it's healthy. Is it capable of detecting these types of problems? Is it unable to heal itself in terms of these issues? It really starts to raise fundamental questions, at least in my mind, about the capability of the organization. Here's another one that drives me crazy. So I look at software test results and I see the pass as expected checkbox. So they ran some tests for 30 minutes and all they did was check the box at the end saying, yep, it worked. That drives me crazy, and the reason is it's not descriptive of what they actually did. What it really is descriptive of what they thought they did. So it gets back to that other issue. It's the danger of the green bar. So when I'm in an operational role, I don't fear the problems that we know about, the red stuff. I fear the green stuff that is actually broken. And so in being aware that just because it allegedly passes doesn't mean that it actually does pass. So those are the things that I fear the most, and I look for those particular parts. Like I said, don't focus on what you intend to do, focus on what you actually did. Another one that drives me crazy is lullaby language. So when I read documentation, and it has lots of should and may or bad safety language in terms of all, or some of the other words that Jerry Weinberg uses. What I think the purpose of that particular language or evidence is it's supposed to discourage feedback, discourage any conversation. Do people know what shallow agreement is? Can I see hands? Shallow agreement, some hands. So shallow agreement is all about where we think we're communicating we have a definition of a particular term, So it passes. So I say it passes, you agree, you agree that it passes, and then I discovered that my definition of passing isn't actually lined up with your particular definition of passing, but we usually discover this later and when it's more critical. So lullaby language in terms of the way evidence is constructed and explained tends to try to create shallow agreement, which damages the ability of people to communicate and damages the strength of the evidence. It tends to lull you into false sense of security. And what it really is it's a stylized ceremony or a stylized artifact. So it really isn't about the object itself. It's not trying to inform you. It's not trying to inform someone else about how to make a decision. What it really is a way to try to provoke a behavior from someone. So here it is. It's constructed just as you expect. Go move on and go look at something else. So the intention is usually to have the person accept this as sufficient. So agree on the shallow agreement and then move on. One of the things, so an example of this that drives me a little crazy is the boards with the happy faces and the sad faces on it. If I don't see real thoughtfulness put into how to describe those particular and make those particular choices, that board tends to become a ceremonial object as opposed to a useful tool to invoke conversation. So when I'm looking at tools and artifacts, what I'm looking for is, when I'm auditing you, I look at the artifact to make sure that it's good, but I'm also looking to hear that there was the conversation that occurred behind it that generated that particular artifact. So, anybody speak Japanese? Can anyone? Do you know how to say it? Because I don't know how to say it, but I know what it means. Great, thank you. So I know it is go and see. So this type of behavior is really combated by the idea of go and see from lean. So the idea is assume that all your documentation is defective in some way, that it's not, that it's all lies. So there was a great story from Toyota where a consultant from Toyota was actually at a new place and they were on the third floor with all the managers going through all the particular data, trying to understand what the problem was down on the production floor. And they'd been there for like 2 hours and he was sitting in the corner observing. And eventually he just got fed up and he started yelling out that it's lies, all lies. All the documentation, all the reports, all the evidence that they were looking at wasn't true. What they needed to do was get out of the office, go to the floor, look at the process, take their own measurements. And it also applies very much in my world where while I look at the evidence, I never assume that the evidence is true. The evidence is a map. The evidence is a simplification of reality. If you really want to understand what happened, you need to go to the place and look and see what actually happened, which is my issue around test results often because it's so ephemeral, it's disappeared, so I can't actually see it. If I audit you, or when I audit you, what will happen often is that I'll pick out a chunk of evidence about how you tested, and I will go to your floor and I'll ask one of your testers to run this procedure again. And as they run it, I will be comparing it against the evidence that I have next to it, seeing and confirming that they actually behaved in the way that they asserted, that the results that they got matched the results that they stored. And you can find interesting deviations in the way that people actually run things versus the way that they assert that they actually run things in that environment. So that's why, another reason why I like video is it's the actual thing that happened. And we're good. So efficiency and time pressure. So another problem that I see around evidence is when efficiency and time pressure is put, a emphasis on efficiency and time pressure is put on test groups in particular, it really biases the particular observer in terms of what are they looking for, and it primes the subject to not see the other things. So hands please. Who knows the moonwalking bear, the basketball being passed around? Okay, if you haven't seen it, I'm not going to play it. But if you haven't seen it, you have to watch it. And it's a problem. This is a problem for the way I test because I videotape everything, and then I can play it back later. I run the danger that my tester was locked onto a particular problem, and meanwhile, something that was blatantly obvious walked through the scene of my product that's catastrophic in some way or hints towards catastrophe, and it was totally missed by my particular tester, but it's recorded for forever in my documentation that I'm showing to my regulatory people. So that's a danger I have. So in my environment, I need to be very careful about making sure that people defocus periodically and look and see the entire scene and understand the entire context of what they're observing. This reminds me of a story. So when I worked in a digital imaging area for healthcare, there was an example that was given about a client, a doctor, who was working in an emergency room, and there was a small child who came in as a patient, and they had to do x-rays on them. They were complaining of like pain in their lower abdomen, and they did the test on them. They took x-rays, and they looked at it, and he looked at it, and he said, okay, it's a normal 4-year-old, okay, they have a hospital gown on, nothing observed, and moved on. So make the long story short, at the trial, they take that x-ray up and they stick it up there, and they ask the doctor to explain the x-ray, and he goes through the whole thing, and at the end of it they point, here's the child, here's the gown, normal buttons and everything. At the end of it, the defense lawyer for the parents point out, see this button here? And everyone looks at it, including the people who are the jury. Notice this little piece of pointy metal sticking out of the button? And so once they saw it, they realized that the child had swallowed a tack, but the radiologist wasn't looking for that, therefore he was locked on to some other type of problem. But once you saw the tack, you couldn't unsee the tack at that particular point in time. So it's the issue of, as you capture really good evidence in that particular sense, once you point out the problem becomes obvious. It creates interesting issues about being able to explain your messaging with upper management. So when another example, when I test, often there's that thorny problem that takes multiple days to figure out, but once you figure out the magic circumstances, it narrows it right down. Then upper management asks, well, why didn't you find it sooner? Why did it take 3 days? So once they only see the results of being able to figure out what the narrow aspects were after you did all that diagnosis. So being able to capture all the particular things going into it is important. So quick summary. So focus on the different qualities and try to recognize what those are in your particular environment. Which ones do you do really well? Which ones maybe you are unaware of or don't necessarily do well? And then determine how your particular evidence might be deficient. Recognize the different types of traps. And the primary thing is go observe the particular work. I find that's really helpful. So go to the place, record the information directly. And we're slightly early, but that's good. So questions and stories. So I talked a lot here. What I really want to hear from the audience in particular parts is pull stories out of me that apply into your environment. So ask me how what I do or my information might apply into your circumstances. Cool. Lots of questions. Lots of questions is good. I'm available afterwards also. I don't go home until tomorrow. I have email. Really? We have online questions? That's a good one. Cool. If only Paul was available.
Paul Holland.
Calling Paul Holland.
Sir, we just had a tweet from Nancy Kellum, who's been trying all morning to figure out the tweet printer, and she finally had one come through that said, I think I have this printer thing figured out, and
Excellent.
she does. Congratulations. Thank you, Calgary. 30.
So, two parts, I guess, and maybe I need to do them separate. So I did some quote validation work in the pharma industry, and it was very, as similar to what you were describing, very documentation heavy. Check the checker.
Yep.
Don't strike anything out or obliterate anything. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on relative to what we're talking about here with exploratory and applications for that in the pharma space or in a heavily regulated space where there's high documentation requirements.
So how does it apply in those environments?
Or has it been applied in those environments?
Yeah.
I suppose is the question.
I worked at a clinical research organization where we analyzed heartbeats to determine whether or not new drugs would cause sudden cardiac death. That was the tool that we made. And we validated that tool using the method I described where we literally videotaped our design reviews. We videotaped our testing itself, and we used primarily exploratory testing. So I did it there. I currently consult into a number of different class 1, 2, and 3. So things that won't kill you, things that your doctor, if we make a mistake, might kill you by accident, and then things that you'll, like the class 3 that I just worked on, where we might accidentally kill lots of you quickly. So we've used exploratory testing in those areas also, and documented it in similar ways. Some people video, some people use session-based recording, like the one.
Q-Trace.
Thank you. And I'm not the only one. James, I know, has done exploratory testing in medical devices also.
Can you just say the name of that?
The name of the tool that Griffin just mentioned.
Reporter?
Rapid Reporter is Shmuel's tool, Shmuel Gershon's tool. That one's more manual entry, though. It's still useful. But the one that automatically captures is from QA Symphony, one of the sponsors. It's called Q-Trace.
That one's very awesome. I'm looking to try to apply that into my environment.
Number 4, Rich?
So my background before I got into software testing was nuclear power. I know. I was actually too close. One of the things that is hard to teach is the balance between trusting your indications and not relying on your indications. Because if you tell people, well, go out and look, don't just trust the gauge back in the control room, what happens is when people see one gauge that doesn't match their preconceptions, they say, well, I don't trust the gauge. Do you ever run into the problem where if something only shows up on one report of many, the initial reaction is, well, since I really need to walk out there to see that for sure, that's probably the weird, because you can't trust the logs, you can't really trust the report. Do you ever run into a case where people get that sort of blindness where
Paranoia?
Well, I don't know if paranoia is the right word, but where they say, if they see only one thing that doesn't match their expectations, and they already know the real way to verify this is to walk out there, they say, well, I can discount that because I can walk out there, and it's only one thing, so probably that's
So that
That's
is the
focus.
danger of self-censoring the data, saying that, well, it was only once, therefore I can't reproduce it, so I'm going to discount it and ignore it at this point. Meanwhile, if they'd just gone to the floor, they would recognize that the problem's actually occurring more frequently. It's just being hidden by some other reason. That good? Wait for the microphone. Sorry, Paul. I like follow-up.
Do you have an example by any chance?
Where that happened? Yes. So, worked with a client. The client had issues on the particular piece of equipment where it was being, the issue was being, you could see it in the log, but it was discounted because of some of the assumptions around how the equipment was being used. It wasn't using real material, efficient, because the real material was still going through R&D, and what was actually available through a real production process was so limited that we couldn't use it all the time. In that particular case, we discounted the problem because, and didn't do that particular check of how it was working until later when we had sufficient supply, and all of a sudden the problem ballooned in that environment. And then we went to the floor and it became obvious what the problem was. And if we had gone back and earlier and looked, we could have found it. It just would have been painful at that time. Is that, I have to be kind of vague so I don't disclose, but yeah.
Griffin, as you know, I've done a lot of years in medical device testing and showing evidence.
And her name is Jean Ann Harrison, for those of you who can't see her following at home.
And that's Paul's voice.
That was Paul. Everyone knows my voice. Everyone.
It's true. People do know Paul. And anyway, so I've done the exploratory testing, which is brought up earlier, and couldn't get my yellow card up fast enough. But I have done many, many hours, and I've done time boxing. I've also done exploratory testing with many hours, days, and recording that evidence all kinds of different ways. I have not used video. I have used forms. You know what? I go to a spreadsheet, and I use a spreadsheet with my forms. And if anybody wants to see any examples, I did bring some here today, or I should say, I have them on my email. So please feel free to ask.
Yeah. Regarding tools, you made a nice point that I want to emphasize. I like lots of simple tools in combination, so I try not to find the monolithic single solution from a large company in Seattle that solves all my problems. I would prefer to have many little things that do things very well, that have a small footprint, and that way I can sort of tailor my tool choices about how to collect evidence to the particular situation.
I've used, honestly, and you brought up the point of little tools.
Oh, yeah.
And I can tell you, when I've sat there, one of the best ways that best things that I've done is use sticky notes on my desk. So when you're talking tools, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're using something that's automated. It doesn't mean that it's software. It doesn't mean that it's a particular thing from, I don't know, Microsoft. Yes, I did say the name. But it can mean just simple little things like rulers, pieces of paper, anything you can to get the work done, and then to use it as your evidence. It's okay, even for a regulated environment.
Yep. Digital cameras, even your phone, are wonderful. Notebooks with pen and paper. I'm good. Jing, I like Jing. Desktop capture, simple annotation. Go.
Just in the topic of tools, I'm really intrigued with this idea of using video to record sessions. I'm imagining a couple of difficulties, though, one being how you index and find that information later.
Yep.
Maybe you could describe a little bit about
I
how
do
you
it two
that.
ways. So I have a table of contents that's sorted by time. and says, okay, these are what they are. And my sessions run anywhere from 15 minutes to 2 hours. I do absolutely zero image editing of those, so you hear all the ums and ands and I don't knows, and you see the long pauses, because first of all, I don't want to damage and edit it, because it's raw evidence. Also because I don't want to have to spend the time. It's not that important. And so video, so a problem with video, and it's kind of interesting. I felt uncomfortable when I first started doing it, but I got over it in terms of hearing my own voice and being able to talk as I test. So be able to describe, okay, here I am on this day, I'm about to do this test, this is the purpose, this is how I'm going to set it up, this is what I'm going to expect to have happen, I'm going to take these actions. And doing play-by-play and learning how to do that, many people, or many is the wrong word, I've encountered people that work for me that feel uncomfortable about hearing their own voice. I've worked in work environments where it becomes an issue if I have multiple people trying to do this because of the noise issues. And then there's people that just don't like having their voice recorded, and that's another issue also. I like it. It makes the record keeping simpler. I can talk about it more. I love the idea afterwards.
Okay, we've got 4 on the same thread, and then we've got about 6 new threads and about 6 coming in from online. So we've got 4 more
Questions
on
are
the same
good.
thread.
I won't go away. Sure, hit me.
In regards to video recording tools, like you mentioned, I remember a time I worked at an insurance company within a particular group, and these guys used to document every single test case, and worse, screen captures, multiple sometimes, of every single test case. And I suggested at the time, hey, maybe we could use some kind of recording tool or video recording tool. And my argument at that time was just, hey, we'll save a lot of time. We could focus on actual testing.
Absolutely.
It was kind of shot down. I didn't pursue it more because I moved on to another group within the same company that I didn't care about it as much because it wasn't required. Had I stayed in that group and I wanted to kind of follow up on my argument, present more than just time, what would you have suggested to me at that time?
So I was once the big screenshot person back in the day. So I would have literally about that many screenshots stacked up at the end of the project. I challenge anyone to look at those screenshots and know what I was doing. And what was I looking at? What was the important piece? So video, and especially video with audio where I'm doing play-by-play, you're hearing what I'm doing, you're seeing the context of how it's changing, you're hearing what I'm thinking, and if I can do a quick screenshot while the video is going, and then circle the big thing that I'm looking at as the video is going, that's really cool and powerful. So.
Yeah, same thread on the topic of when and how you record the testing sessions. In a agile project environment where you're testing iteratively as development is happening, do you record all the way through the project lifespan? Because in the early builds of the product, is it relevant what you're finding at that time for evidence?
So in my environment, I would, and it's supportive evidence. It also is good practice, and it makes people comfortable with the process. I'll even go beyond that. There's situations where I've had and gone to development and had development record unit testing, because it was infinitely easier for me to have the developer talk through and explain unit testing through a video than to try to write a white paper that then explains what they allegedly did around unit testing. So I prefer to do it as sooner versus later. The evidence is often not necessarily even accessed, but it's always available for review at some point in time. Did I sufficiently answer it, or do you want to?
So you record all the way through the project, not just like a pre-release final report type of sessions.
So I'm context driven. So what that means is I'm inclined to try to do it because I've often said, you know, we just had this impromptu 30-minute meeting, and I really wish we had, or session, testing session, and I really wish we had recorded it. And so that's a trigger for me that I should be default is we should be figuring a way to capture this information in some appropriate manner, using some appropriate tool, and then apply that in those situations by default.
All right, thanks for that.
Cool.
So that was the third new thread, technically the same thread, brought back in as a new one in disguise. So we've only really done 2, and we've got about 6 to go. So we're actually going to cap that one right now, and if we have time at the end, we'll come back to it. So that's 3 and 185. You've been capped.
We'll talk afterwards.
And if you can keep your answers a bit briefer as well, Griffin.
Will do.
We'll be able to get through all of these new threads. So let's move to 163.
Hey there. Did you find any reason or benefit down here?
Thank
sorry,
you.
From trying to record the developer interaction with a bug report once it had gone through a recorded tester session to see if what the developer was reading actually matched up with what the tester saw during the process?
Absolutely. The recorded bug report of what actually happened was incredibly powerful for the dev. Seeing the dev go through that process, it was intermediate whether or not, or intermittent whether or not we would record the dev, depending on the situation. But yeah, being able to very clearly show what I actually did is really powerful.
Okay. We've got some questions from the net as well.
Cool.
This is from Taster, from Like or Leash, something like that.
Sure.
I have a question for Griffin Jones. How do you make the evidence, particularly recordings, searchable?
How do I measure it?
Searchable.
How
Searchable.
do you
I'll
make the
translate the
evidence?
Kiwi.
Searchable.
Searchable, thank you. So I index it by 2 ways. I index it by date and time, and I know, given my summary report of what we were doing as we were testing, what was tested during that time. I also index it usually by subject. So I know a particular, if I'm tracing requirements, I know these requirements trace into this, and the granularity is set appropriately. I don't need to be able to find things in 1 minute, but I need to be able to find things within an hour. So I look for a way that works in that situation.
Grep. And following on from that, is it just the file level ability to make it searchable, or is it also within the file video audio recording?
Usually in my notes, my session charter notes, I keep, I do 2 things. Oh, this is, I think I learned this from John. So there's particular points in time where I'll clap, and I'll do this to the audience, sorry. So I get an audio, a visual in the audio to find key points in the particular video, in the particular session, if I want to go back to those.
With a blink test.
Yes, exactly. And then I'll keep, if there's key points that I want to index directly into, I'll make notes in my session report that on this point in time, well, bugs are a great example. Go to 19 minutes and 34 seconds for this particular bug.
Thank you. We have one from Veritex, which has been answered, which was about Rapid Reporter. So we'll move on. And just to clear this small stack, do you routinely, this is also from Tester from Leak, do you routinely get your team to review their evidence to deal with a defocusing problem?
Ooh, not as much as I would wish, because, so there's time pressure also.
There's a few others.
Wow.
These ones aren't actually for Griffin. These are all from Nancy. Gotta say, I love the new tweet printer, but who doesn't? Thank you, Nancy. Will there be interviews with CAS 2013 after the sessions like there were last year? Yes, there will be. And has Paul Holland kept his promise of giving out hugs? Yes. All right, that clears the printer stack.
Cool.
Who's next?
So confirmation, we have 15 minutes, right? 12:20, right? 15 minutes. We're good.
All right. I know, like when you're doing a project and you're, taking evidence as you're going along. How do you sort of maintain the integrity of like a live database. So like either, we have a database of scripted tests that pass or fail or what have you, or a production database of certain things in existence, that keeps them being updated on a regular basis. We can audit those through the application, but of course DBAs can go in and do like all sorts of interesting things to a database.
Yes, they can.
How do you stop that or audit that or control that, et cetera?
So authorization's a big deal in my environment. So people are only given appropriate level of authorization to do things. So people can't accidentally or maliciously damage the evidence itself, destroy the evidence by accident. Ultimately, even the people with authorization, it has to be logged that the DB went on this day and made changes to the particular data, and we know who you were and where you were and when you did it. And there should also really be a description of why are you authorized to do that and why did you make the change. And that's one of those things that tends to go through, that's something that would be checked fairly early in an audit of an organization to make sure that they've constrained people's authorities appropriately. That help? Cool. Sure.
Yeah. My name is Dan Skybo. I actually work at the same company as that guy,
Cool.
although on different teams. So you mentioned that you thought that it was a problem that people would have generic logins to a test environment, and I was kind of hoping that you would expound on that. That's what we do. It's all generic data, so there's no real risk of theft or anything like that. I was wondering if you could tell a story.
Okay, so I'm going to audit, yeah, so if I audited you and I pulled out a problem report that was generated by this generic tester at some point in time, or during that session, how would I know who did it? How would I be able to attribute who the person was that was logged in this generic way? He's going to need the mic. Oh, this is going to be interactive. Yeah.
So I would actually expect that to be in the reporting. We use Jira to track all that stuff, and the person reporting it would be presumably the person who found it.
So bug reports are never reported by people that didn't find them in your environment?
Well, I mean, the clients, if the client calls into tech support, then it'll be the tech support person who assisted them that would report it. I guess they didn't actually directly find it themselves, although they would have seen it and observed it.
So it depends on risk. So
Right.
look at the particular system, determine whether or not attributability is a critical aspect of this, and try to, if it is a significant risk, then I'm going to expect stronger controls around who the people are and a logging of what they're doing and why.
Okay.
And so be context driven is all I'm saying. I guess I'm kind of saying.
Thank you.
Sure. Nope.
Yeah, it's good. Is it on? Green light?
Try now.
Hillary's new at the mic thing, sorry. Have to
You
excuse me.
mentioned earlier about lullaby language and how you shouldn't use could, should, and would, but you don't want to use absolutes either. So where's that middle ground of the wording that you do use so that you're not using the lullaby language just to get the shallow agreement?
I have to keep this short, so this could turn into a one-day workshop, this answer. The simple answer is, for me personally, I use the satir model in terms of, I usually go to the data question, what did I see or hear? So I talked about observation. I interpret what that means. I describe what the significance is. So that's no.
Can you give me an example?
I'm struggling at this moment. Can you rephrase the question, please? Just help me out.
So I'm not sure I can rephrase it well.
Okay. Can you restate the question?
When you were talking about the lullaby language, you're saying if you use the could, would, and should, you tend to get these shallow agreements.
Right.
But if you use absolutes, then aren't you also in dangerous territory? So what's the language between those two?
Okay, it's not so much, well, the language is important. What really is happening is I'm looking to hear that there was thoughtfulness behind the description of what happened. I'm looking for a thoughtful, intelligent conversation, engineering conversation behind making the meaning of what the results were. So hopefully there was observations that had appropriate interpretation of what the meaning was and had appropriate significance applied to it. Is that slightly more, I'm being slightly vague. If you catch me afterwards, I will think of, when I walk off of here, I'll remember a fantastic example. I'm having trouble pulling that out at the moment. I'm sorry.
Okay, with your use of video and recording, has that ever worked against you as far as things like discoverability, where you're intending to record one thing and during the course of review of that evidence, they find something else unintended that kind of shoots you in the foot?
Not at the moment, but it's a fear. I've not had to go through that at the moment. And quite frankly, that's the danger of my particular approach, and that's the major objection that I hear from higher level executive people. They like fake-ish summary reports of what the testing was, because it's not, you can't actually confirm it in that way, as opposed to my recordings are so raw that you do record things that were not necessarily intended and can be found in discovery.
I think that brings up another question about, like, when people check their email or update their LinkedIn profile, or
oh yeah,
how do you deal with that if
on my
being
test
recorded?
system as they're testing? So they're leaking personal. I could take that way. They're leaking personal information. First of all, if it's not inside the scope of what the testing is supposed to be doing, why exactly are you doing that on my systems as you're testing? So that's violating the process of how we're doing testing. So that's bad at a real fundamental level. The other issue is the personal private information, and that's its own topic of recording that information is bad from my point of view if I don't need it. So don't do it. In the back.
Hello again. I wanted to ask, you kept mentioning things about being an auditor and presenting evidence. It made me wonder, would it be good? Yeah, I know, it's scary. It made me wonder whether or not testers would be good auditors.
Absolutely.
And should we pursue that?
It's a fantastic, you probably haven't even thought about it, but doing auditing is incredibly similar to doing testing. So you're working, usually you walk into a new organization, you don't know who they are, maybe you sent them a questionnaire, and then you sit down and you diagnose what was happening in that particular organization over time by looking at their evidence and interviewing people. And at the end you write up, you have findings, bug reports, you write a conclusion about what you saw. I saw this, I interpreted it as this, and you organize that into a set of results that you then present to management. And it's really auditing people. When you audit other organizations, executive management truly cares about your results, so it's an incredibly powerful activity. And yes, it's a fantastic way to transition from testing into auditing. It's very applicable. I like it. I recommend it. John?
It's on.
Sure.
Thank you for the talk, Griffin.
You.
If I may selfishly say, it goes nicely with my keynote about argument. You have a lot of good material here, and it made me wonder about some of the issues I was taking with Stuart Reed and about argument. The evidence that he purported to have about exploration and certification and those kind of things. So as we go to conferences and learn from colleagues, and we see talks that present evidence about something. I guess what I'm left with is that you are used to high scrutiny, like almost court case level preparation. And in our testing, that doesn't happen very often. But as you talk to us and know that we're not all in a regulated environment, but we have to make arguments for certain things, to what degree do you propose that we get deeper into preparing for scrutiny, maybe not at the court case level or the regulated level, but as something we could take back to our desks and say, this may be a useful thing to make us more credible?
Right, so excellent question, thank you. I would look at those different qualities, examine how they apply into your organization, probably pick out the one, start with one. One's a good place to start. One that's the weakest, and then say, what is the simplest thing I could do to make this slightly better than it currently is? Get an early success, see if people have an interest in doing that, and move from there. Your question triggered a quick comment on my part. So the way I actually do this activity is I have simultaneously running through my head, I'm always during the project, evaluating every piece of evidence and every conversation I'm having, whether or not it's going to meet this criteria. So I project myself into the future, sitting in front of the external auditor and having to explain what I did and why I'm doing it right. That piece of evidence, what I did and why I did it that way. And so that runs constantly, and when it trips, when I get an emotional trigger and that I hit my trigger on that, then I stop and we have a conversation at the project level about what we're doing.
Would you
want to follow?
Would you like to reply to that? Okay, we've got no cards on the stack and 1 minute 53 to go. Does anybody have anything that's burning?
Do you want to go back on the cap?
Did we empty the same thread
They've
from
been
earlier?
emptied.
It's been emptied, yep.
Cool. What question should you have asked me?
Griffin, what question should we have asked you?
Cool. That's an interesting question. Thank you, Paul.
No problem. Remembering you only have 1 minute left to answer it.
I didn't fully appreciate this topic until I really worked at my startup and took responsibility for being the interface to our clients and being the person that had to sit in the room for about 3 or 4 days and answer questions and defend what we did with the documentation that was sitting at the table. Having gone through that process and being the person who was responsible was incredibly enlightening to me about why these things are important. So my suggestion is look for that particular person in your organization, go have lunch with them or go buy them a cookie and find out what their particular problems are. And you might find a friend in that particular person. So that's my thought.